Hi, I'm Jade Guthrie. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the curriculum lead at Food Share Toronto. We're a food justice organization. Today we are here at Flemo Farm in Flemington Park. This is one of the Food Share farms that we partner with community members on. So we're going to head in there and check it out. Okay, so we're here in Flemo Farm. We're in Flemington Park, a neighborhood in Toronto, kind of near the Science Centre. This is a really popular landing spot for newcomers and refugees. It's a really diverse neighborhood, fairly racialized, fairly low income, and so this kind of community-run farm is a project that's been 10 years in the making. It's a really big step towards building food justice in this neighborhood, building to kind of taking down those barriers to food access that show up here in this neighborhood as a result of what we like to call food apartheid. The language of food desert might be something that you're more familiar with. It's more mainstream language, but at Food Share, we do like to use the language of food apartheid because it kind of speaks to the ways in which certain neighborhoods lacking access or facing more barriers to access around food is something that is created structurally. It's something that's created intentionally rather than something that occurs naturally in an ecosystem or in nature. So Food Share is one of the partners on this farm. We help kind of lead this project in partnership with many folks in the community who run these plots. I think there's 6 plots here run by community farmers. Food Share, for those of you who don't know us, we are a food justice organization based here in Toronto, Ontario. And what we do is really advocate for the right to food across the city. And we do this by really challenging the systemic barriers that keep people from accessing the food that they need to survive and thrive. These are, in effect, the same barriers that keep people in poverty. So a lot of our work involves kind of advocating and challenging these barriers that perpetuate structural poverty, perpetuate systemic racism, and all of these kind of broader systems of oppression. We do this in a lot of different ways. We wear many different hats and have many different teams. One of our teams is involved in urban ag, like these projects, like this one that you see here. We also have community kitchen programming where we cook together. We have workshops in schools, working with students and youth. We've got baby and toddler nutrition. We've got good food markets, good food boxes. The list goes on and on. But generally, the thread that kind of ties all of our work together is that it's all based around working towards people being able to access the food that they want and the food that they need on their own terms, right? So this idea of agency is really important around our work. We talk about, as an organization, our kind of vision is a Toronto where everybody is able to feed themselves and their families and their communities with dignity and with joy. And this idea of dignity and joy is really important when we talk about accessing food. So like I said, I'm the community food programs curriculum lead and educator at Food Share, which is a very long title. I'm also, outside of my 9-to-5, community organizer with Justice for Migrant Workers. We are a volunteer-led political collective that organizes and fights for the rights of migrant farm workers across the country. I know that y'all are maybe in first year or third year, and you're kind of maybe beginning to think about what you're going to do beyond school. And so I can talk a little bit about what led me to getting into the work that I do now. It wasn't really like a straightforward, simple path getting here for me. I started out by doing an undergrad degree in English Lit at York. I was always really interested in stories and the stories that we tell about ourselves and about our communities. And out of that, I thought I was going to be a writer, and that didn't happen. So I ended up going back to school for a master's in communication and culture, and that was at York in partnership with X University. And I did a 2-year program there and ended up doing an internship with an organization not too far from here, actually, called Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee. And they do a lot of work around food security, food justice, and placemaking within their community. And doing that internship, I learned so much, and it really kind of opened up my eyes to all of the really cool food justice work that's happening across the city already. So after I finished that up, I was like, oh, I really want to like learn more about food justice. I want to learn more about building community and organizing. So I went back to school another time and did another 2-year degree. I did an MSW, Master's of Social Work, at York again. And that is where I really was able to dive deep and explore concepts like intersectionality that I know is like a really big part of this course, as well as, things like anti-racism, talking about decolonizing or anti-colonial practices, feminist practices, just like it really opened up my eyes to how we can apply a critical lens to the work that we do with communities and in partnership with communities. And I went into that program thinking, I want to work with communities. I came out of it knowing I wanted to work with communities, but having a completely different approach to it and really kind of adopting that critical lens that I think is super important when we're working with communities, particularly with folks who have been marginalized by the systems in place. So I came out of that. I did 2 placements during that degree. One was with the STOP Community Food Center, where I got to learn a little bit more about food justice and work in the food bank there and the drop-in meal kind of center space, which was a learning experience. And then I also did a placement at the City of Toronto in the social policy division, or department rather. And that was also a really big learning experience, kind of being in this big institution and understanding how policy was made. After that, I decided, the kind of institutional vibe was not for me. I worked there for about a year after my degree ended, and just so happened that as my contract was ending at the city, there was a spot opening up at Food Share for a job that I wasn't super interested in. It was about evaluating a project, and that wasn't really like what I wanted to do, but I knew that Food Share was an organization that I really wanted to work with. So I saw it and I was like, I'm going to get in, and then I'm just going to try to like move around once I get in there. And I got really lucky when I applied that I was able to secure that position. And I've been at Food Share ever since. So it's been about 2.5 years now. At Food Share, I've been in, I think, 3 or 4 different positions at this point, but I'm in one that's permanent now, which is really nice and quite rare for the nonprofit world as well. I'm really lucky that Food Share is super committed as an organization to being like a decent work employer. So we've got livable wages, and we're also trying to shift more towards, permanent contracts instead of temporary gig work, which is really difficult to find in the nonprofit world. You'll find if you kind of go into that sector. Now every day I get to work with folks across the city, and we cook together and we eat together and we preserve food together and talk about the food system. So all of my work really centers around food and learning around food and exchanging knowledge around food. And I think it's important to mention that like my entire life, food has been very much like a central theme in my life. My mom is from Nova Scotia, but my dad is Jamaican Chinese, and he was born in Jamaica, grew up in Jamaica. So my entire side of the family is there. And so food for me has always been a really important and meaningful way to connect with like those parts of my identity, especially because a lot of my family are overseas. And so being able to kind of like feel connected to those roots, food has always been a crucial way for me to do that. And so in my work with communities, cooking food and eating food together and sharing meals, that sense of community, that sense of connection is a really big part of like the guiding reasons around why I do it. And then in terms of my organizing work, I love doing organizing with Justice for Migrant Workers. I think we're such a cool collective. Maybe I'm biased, but we're like really radical and really like overtly political, which I think is really important in community organizing work at the grassroots level. And the way I got into that really was I had seen Migrant Dreams, which is a documentary that Min Suk Lee made, as well as there's another one she has called, I think, El Contrato. Both of those were kind of set here in Ontario, and it was about the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, which is a national program we have here in Canada that brings migrant farm workers in from, so-called developing countries to work on farms across Canada to harvest all the delicious fruit and vegetables that we get to eat every day. And when I'd seen that documentary, that was the first time I'd ever heard about this program. It was really new to me. I didn't know that Canada brought migrant farm workers in when I'd initially seen the documentary. And after watching that, I started to kind of have some conversations with friends and family members. And, like I mentioned, my family's from Jamaica. So we had, friends and family members connected to us who had come in through that program. And so that's when I really got kind of engaged and wanted to learn more and wanted to get involved. MNCCLE is like affiliated with Justice for Migrant Workers. The folks that you see in Migrant Dreams, if you do watch it, which is available online to watch for free. She's affiliated with Justice for Migrant Workers. A lot of the folks that you see in the film are part of Justice for Migrant Workers, the workers, as well as the organizers that you see. And so I knew that I wanted to get involved with J4MW. At the time, I was living with my roommate, who was also really interested in labor rights and unions. So we went to a volunteer orientation together and ended up being like, yes, we totally want to get involved. And we quickly learned that like community organizing is not organized at all. It was just like a massive WhatsApp chat with like 100 people in it being like, hey, we need someone to do this. Like, can anyone do it? Or like, there's this thing we need to write about, or there's this thing that we need to like deliver to a worker. And so we just like quickly kind of jumped into this work and got involved. And, like next thing we knew, we were like driving out to Leamington and helping to like organize dinners, or we were like, during COVID, there was a lot of mutual aid stuff that came up. So we were like figuring out how to get food out to workers who were quarantined on farms, or, I got the chance to like write some op-eds around, raising a bit of like public awareness around what the SAWP is. And so it was really exciting for me to kind of like jump into the world of community organizing. And it was a learning experience as well, because it was kind of like, okay, this is just like, there's no right way to do it, right? You just kind of like start doing it and you figure it out as you go, and you make a lot of mistakes as you go as well. But there's so much to learn, and there's so much connection there. It's been amazing to like build so many different relationships with, like fellow activists, as well as like workers who are the most amazing activists. So that's that story. In terms of intersectionality, it's a really important theory that I apply to all of the work that I do every day, all day. I think when we're talking about the issue or the problem of food insecurity, applying a very critical intersectional lens to understanding it as an issue is really crucial. What happens when we don't apply an intersectional lens to the problem of food insecurity is that we depoliticize the problem. And we end up seeing responses to it that are kind of like temporary Band-Aid solutions, right? So something like food charity, so food banking or drop-in meals, those kinds of responses come out of a lack of intersectional analysis, right? So when we talk about something like food justice in and of itself is a very intersectional response to food insecurity. So maybe a good way to kind of look at it is to think about the food system itself, right? And to understand how our food system is embedded within much kind of broader systems of oppression and structures of oppression. And then once you kind of understand those connections, you see the ways in which that trickles down to play out in people's everyday lives, right? And so food insecurity disproportionately impacts certain people. And those certain people or communities are Black folks, Indigenous communities, people who don't have status or migrant farm workers, disabled people, people living on low incomes. So all of these folks with like marginalized identities or marginalized social positions, whatever the language is that you want to use. These are the folks who are hit the hardest by food insecurity and poverty, right? And this is because the food system itself is connected to the systems that keep these folks oppressed. When we talk about food insecurity, we can never have a conversation about food insecurity without talking about structural poverty. The reason that people are food insecure, the number one reason usually, is because they don't have money in their pockets to be able to buy food, right? So we can't continue to have conversations about food insecurity, and we can't continue to build responses to food insecurity without prioritizing how do we lift people out of poverty? How do we end these cycles of poverty that are enforced by the systems in place, right? There's also connections between our food system and, systemic racism and settler colonialism. A really good example of this would be if we look historically and contemporarily at policies around Indigenous food systems, right? So policies like the Indian Act banned traditional potlatch ceremonies, right? The residential system purposely separated Indigenous children from their traditional diets and enforced, this kind of forced assimilation around the 5 white gifts, so things like flour and sugar and non-traditional foods. We also see, like, in the contemporary context, on the East Coast, there were the Mi'kmaq fisher people who were blocked from accessing the traditional, like, hunting and fishing land, right? So there's, like, even within the policy that we have in our food system, there's this kind of attempt to destroy Indigenous communities' relationships with food. Which is the purpose of colonialism, right? To destroy relationships. We could also look at, if we're talking about systemic racism, the way that I mentioned earlier, we have these kind of pockets where we see food apartheid playing out in the city, right? There's certain neighborhoods across Toronto, which are primarily low-income neighborhoods and racialized neighborhoods where we see a lot of Black and Brown and Indigenous folks living. And these neighborhoods lack access to fresh and affordable produce. They lack, they have much fewer buying options around food. And then we also see in the food outlets that they do have in these neighborhoods, like, an over-policing of these spaces, right? We see extra security guards, we see security cameras, we see baby food being locked up, right? And so that is, like, a really clear example, I think, of the ways that systemic racism shows up in our food system. We could also look at the seasonal agricultural worker program as another clear example of how these structures of oppression are really kind of baked into every part of our food system, right? So, like I mentioned, the program brings in workers from so-called underdeveloped or developing countries, like the quote-unquote global south, and it brings workers in on a temporary visa to come work in the fields or the greenhouses across Canada. Workers in this program, they come here on a temporary visa, so they often, in most cases, lack a path to permanent status or permanent residency here. They're viewed as, like, temporary or, like, guests who are here to do a job and then leave. But the reality is that workers who come through this program often come back year after year after year, up to 20, 25 years at a time. And they'll come in for harvest season, which can be as short as 6 months, but can be as long as an entire year, right? They might be going home to see their families just for a month at a time. So they're essentially living here in Canada. They pay into the benefits that we have here, and yet they lack access to accessing those benefits, right? So they don't have access to the social safety net that many Canadians do. So things like universal health care, or things like EI, if you are injured on the job or you can't work for some reason, right? So it's often pitched by the Canadian government as a really kind of inclusive and progressive immigration policy. But what it really is it classifies certain bodies, racialized bodies, from these specific countries as, good enough to exploit for their labor, good enough to profit off of, but not good enough to stay here, right? So it's this kind of, like, second class, not even a citizen because they're not considered citizens, but they're streaming the immigration program, right? Which is something that they claim to have stopped many years ago when they stopped the point system, but it's just a newer version of this, right? And then I think it's really important to note that the way that relationships play out on these farms across the country often replicate plantation dynamics. So if you actually look at how these farms are set up, there's bunkhouses for workers to live at, and they live on the farm most of the time. They're forced to live on the farm because they're not paid enough to live elsewhere. And the bunkhouses are divided by country of origin. So there's, like, a Jamaican bunkhouse and a Guatemalan bunkhouse and a Mexican bunkhouse, right? And so this obviously replicates, like, this, like, type of segregation, but it also is, when you think about it from an organizing standpoint, it's a way to separate people and to ensure that they don't organize and get together and talk, right? There's also the fact that, we can't ignore that most folks who are able to purchase land and own land and employ people on a farm are white settlers here in Canada. And then the majority of workers who are brought in are Black and Brown and racialized, and they might be Indigenous in their own countries, right? So there's these power dynamics playing out around race as well. And then the fact that these employers, when they bring workers in, workers are tied to one employer. So it's a form of indentured servitude. Employers have the power to confiscate workers' passports. They control when workers can go into the city, when they can leave the farm. They control who can come visit them, right? So there's these really oppressive power dynamics that during the pandemic have only been exacerbated by kind of like COVID quarantine rules. They're not covered under the ESA. It's one of the industries that's not covered. So workers are often not paid a minimum wage, so they're living in poverty. That often means then that they themselves are food insecure. So the same folks who are responsible for putting food on the tables of Canadians across the country every day often don't have access to food themselves, right? And that has only been exacerbated by the pandemic with employers keeping workers in quarantine in these like really tiny bunkhouses that are not appropriate for kind of physical distancing. And at the same time, employers have been responsible for providing food for workers and haven't been providing, enough food. Like the portions haven't been big enough. They haven't been nutritionally acceptable. And on top of that, they haven't been culturally relevant, right? Some workers might require like halal meats, or they might not eat meat at all. And employers have not, for the most part, have not been kind of adhering to those rules or the preferences of workers, right? So this program in general, I think, is a really clear example of the ways that these broader kind of systems of oppression play into our food system. Like that program, the SAWP, is very much like the bedrock of our agricultural industry across Canada. Like without these workers, we would not be eating fresh carrots every day or fresh potatoes or whatever it is that you love to eat for your veggies. And that program is such a clear illustration of systemic racism, of imperialism, right? Of like going into another country, extracting labor, extracting resources, and building wealth off of it on stolen land, right? Like it's just such a clear replication of that, or extension of that colonial project here in Canada. So I think, we often hear this narrative that like the food system or whatever system it is that we're talking about is broken, right? Or it's failing us. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not broken. It's working the way that it was built to, right? Like our food system was built on a foundation of racism, of colonialism, of poverty, of, capitalism, like making money while folks suffer. And so the way it's working right now is the way that it was meant to work. And so if we're talking about, a just future, an equitable future for all folks, we need to be talking about transforming the system completely, right? And rebuilding the system. And we see the ways that this like racism and colonialism and these other, isms play out in the food system every day in people's lived experiences. We know that, Black families in Canada are more than 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white families. We know that there are at least 50 long-term boil water advisories in Indigenous communities across the country. We also know that, over 60% of people who rely on social assistance, so things like ODSP, they are struggling to put food on the table every day, right? So we see the ways that poverty and racism and colonialism show up in people's lives every day in terms of like their relationships to food and their experiences with food. And so I think in order to stop leaving these communities behind, or stop, maybe the language is just to stop pushing them further down into poverty rather than leaving them behind, we need to actually like transform and build a new system. In terms of the difficult parts of this work, or maybe like some of the challenges that come up, I would say one of the things that makes this work hard or sometimes challenging on a day-to-day basis is the ways in which mainstream conversations, and by mainstream I mean like the way that the media and the state has kind of framed food insecurity, has really positioned food as like a commodity instead of as a right. And so in that way, it's depoliticized the problem, and it's really removed it from these conversations about like a broader, the broader kind of systems of oppression that play into this. And so then what comes out of that is it can be really difficult to get support. And by support, I mean like support generally, but also like financial support for projects that don't frame it within this kind of context, right? So like I mentioned earlier, when we look at food as a commodity and we respond to it within that context, we see things like food banking, this idea of like food rescue, of like corporations donating leftover food, or we see drop-in meals, right? This kind of like emergency food aid or food charity is a response that becomes the priority in terms of like funding from the government and funding from different like foundations. The reason being that these kinds of responses are really trackable. And so like if you work in the nonprofit sector, you quickly learn that like having targets and being able to reach numbers is a huge part of your day. And it's a huge part of being able to secure funding or support for a project. So for a food bank to be able to say, we, were able to give X number of families a food basket this week, that looks really good to a funder because we're positioning it within this idea of like productivity and like being able to like meet goals, right? And so it really kind of boxes you into these emergency responses that are very much kind of temporary, like Band-Aid solutions, right? And I think it's important to note as well that like food banks themselves, like they've only been around in Canada since the 80s. And yet over the past 40 years, I guess, have become so embedded within the way that our government responds to poverty and food insecurity. Like they started within communities as like a kind of mutual aid initiative for communities and neighbors to take care of one another. And the government saw that and was like, oh, this is a way that we can kind of download responsibility for this problem that's coming up during the recession onto communities, onto the nonprofit sector, onto civil society, and we don't have to worry about it as much. We just kind of like throw some money at it once in a while. And they realized it was this really kind of like at arm's length response that they could adopt and really kind of like enmesh into our system. And so often now when we talk about responses to food insecurity, the first thing that people think of is a food bank, right? We think that's a response, but what food banks are doing is just responding to the immediate need as opposed to actually transforming the conditions that are breeding food insecurity to begin with, right? So like it's not going to solve food insecurity giving someone a couple baskets of rice or whatever it is that's in the cans of food, right? And there's also like the problematic ideas of the fact that like food is not something that you give and someone should be thankful for, right? Food is a human right. And it's something that Canada as a government signed on to in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. We chose to sign on as a country to guarantee the right to food of all citizens, and yet the government has failed to deliver on that responsibility. But back to in terms of like the challenges. So when we frame food within this like capitalism framework of like food as a commodity, food as something to be profited off of, it's really then difficult to get funding or support for projects that aren't going to see that immediate kind of like trackable number results, right? So if you're trying to do systems change work and trying to implement like a long-term response, a long-term solution that's actually sustainable, you're not going to see results in a year, right? Which is often the kind of like funding time bracket that you'll see on a grant application. And you're not going to have numbers that you can show to report back, right? So even a project like this, like Flemo Farm, this has been 10 years in the making, right? And this is just our first year of growing. So it's really difficult to then do the systems change work within this context of like everything needs to happen fast and we need to respond to it right away and we need to see numbers. So I think that's really challenging in terms of doing the work and getting the work done and getting support for things that are already happening on the ground, right? There's so many incredible projects like these happening across the city, but it's just impossible for them to go up against the like red tape and the admin barriers that there are to accessing resources, accessing funding, accessing land. So yeah, it's tough. It's like it's a constant battle pushing back against these systems that are in place, right? And then I think on a more personal note for me, as like a young woman of color, like I'm constantly pushing up against these systems that also like affect my life, right? And like, so coming into contact with systemic racism every day, and that system is like not only impacting the lives of people that I'm working with, but also like my own experiences, right? And so it can be really tiring and it can be exhausting. And I think that's why a lot of people burn out when you're working, in community work and community organizing in this kind of field. Like it's tough to constantly be doing the labor to change the systems that are already like impacting your life negatively, right? But that being said, as exhausting as it can be, what's really like nourishing or like life-giving about the work is being able to like be in community and like in relationship with people with like shared experiences and to like learn from people every day. I feel really lucky to work at Food Share and to do the community organizing work that I do, and to feel like every day I'm going to learn something new just from like talking with someone else and talking about our ideas. And I think it's like fun work because it's really creative. Like coming up with, transforming an entire system is obviously really difficult, and like no one has like the one right answer, but it's really fun to like sit down with people and just imagine new possibilities. And like it's such an exciting thing, right? To just think about these endless possibilities and the ways that things could change and could look in the future. And then to actually like, to have these conversations and to dream big, kind of like blue sky it, but then also to like then make plans to action that. And then like having something like Flemo Farm play out and be like, this is a future, like this is an alternative future for our food system, right? And so like to see those possibilities play out and like have that really like hope-giving feeling of like, yeah, it is possible and like we can do this, and it's happening everywhere across the city already in so many communities. So I feel like that sense of connection and community and hopefulness, that sense of kind of like collective hope is what really inspires me to continue doing the work. So in terms of like, building this future together and like working towards food justice, like I said earlier, our vision at Food Share is this Toronto city where everyone has the ability to feed themselves and their families and their communities with dignity and with joy. And I think the really like important part of that vision for me is like this idea of joy and this idea of like everybody like living joyfully and like being able to experience like comfort and relaxation and like to take pleasure in the food that we eat is such an important part of like what I imagine in terms of like what a food just future looks like. And that obviously means then like we need to transform these systems, and we need to build systems that actually support communities and support people, that don't like continue to oppress people or leave people behind. I think what that means at the end of the day is following the lead of communities. I think the only way we can get to that just future is by, like I mentioned, there's so many people already doing the work of imagining new solutions, of imagining new systems, of building those systems already. And what needs to happen is just like resource sharing and wealth sharing and support and like labor going into supporting those folks who are already doing this really important work, right? Like the blueprints are there. People know what they need. People know what they want. And so we, like as a collective, just need to support that in whatever way possible. And, I think COVID has obviously fundamentally altered so many things in our world. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the issue of food insecurity, the issue of poverty, like it existed long before COVID, but in many ways has been like exacerbated by the pandemic, as well as has been kind of like brought to the light for like mainstream audience, right? For like folks who didn't experience it before, it's like they're suddenly seeing that this is happening, although people have been telling everyone for years and years that this has been a problem. And so I think there is this kind of like new sense of collectivity that has come out of the pandemic, that already existed within many communities to begin with, but it's kind of maybe more widespread now. And so there's this sense of being able to really like push forward and to build that future that we want to, and to actually like put those imagined possibilities into action. And I think that like idea of action is really important. We had Karen Washington come and speak as a keynote speaker at one of our Food Share conferences, and Karen said that food justice is an action word, it's a verb. And so I think that is a really crucial thing to think about when we're talking about like, how do I get involved or how do I join in or support, right? It's like, it's taking action. And, you know, one of those actions is obviously like educating yourself and like learning about the food system. I think we kind of like live in this world where we've very intentionally been disconnected from our food system, you know, by like the systems or the people in power, because the less that you know about where your food comes from or who's growing your food or who has access to food, then the less inclined you are to like want to change that system, right? And so it's been this like intentional separation of people from food and people from land as well. And so I think part of it is relearning, unlearning, and then like rebuilding those connections to food. But it takes more than just educating yourself. Like, I think it's a really important first step, but the action part comes after education. I think it's, you know, it's engaging in political advocacy, and political advocacy around food justice is not just concerned with like food prices or food growing. Like I mentioned earlier, food insecurity and food is so enmeshed in so many other systems. And so political advocacy around food justice also means like advocating for livable wages, advocating for decent work, advocating for affordable childcare or affordable housing, right? Like all of these things affect people's ability to put food on the table. And so political advocacy is letter writing, calling MPs, signing petitions, all of these like political actions around these broader systems of oppression too, because those all will come together to build a more just future and a more food just future. And then I think also like engaging in community action as well, right? Whether that's supporting initiatives that are already existing in your community, like, you know, looking to those initiatives and asking, you know, what's the best way that I'm positioned to support here? Is it by redistributing wealth? Is it by like helping find resources? Is it by like lending labor? Like, what is it that folks need that are already doing that work? Maybe it's like getting involved in grassroots organizing, like Justice for Migrant Workers or People's Pantry. You know, there's so many incredible initiatives that are already happening. And so it's just kind of like taking that scary step of like just diving right in, because like I mentioned, community organizing is messy and it's never perfect. And so it's like not being afraid to make mistakes and just being like, hey, I'm just going to like do it and I'm going to learn along the way. And it's probably going to be really difficult, but it's also going to be super rewarding and like connecting and life-giving.